A billionaire drives a stranded mom and son home in the rain, when the boy asks, "Is this how love begins?" His mom laughs it off, dismissing him, before freezing in shock at what the billionaire does next. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The rain lashed against the windshield in relentless sheets, the wipers struggling to keep up as Tristan Sinclair guided his sleek black car through the near-empty streets. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, fractured and blurred by the storm. It had been a long day, a series of back-to-back meetings that left him drained and impatient to get home. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed lingering in discomfort, and the storm was just one more irritation in an already exhausting evening. He turned onto a quieter road, thinking only of the warmth waiting in his penthouse, when something on the shoulder of the road caught his eye. A car sat stranded in the downpour, hazard lights blinking weakly, steam rising from under the hood. Next to it, barely visible through the rain, a woman stood with a small child wrapped in her arms, their clothes soaked through, their figures hunched against the cold. His instinct was to drive past. Someone else would stop. Someone always did. He wasn't in the habit of getting involved in other people's problems. He had spent years ensuring his life was controlled, predictable, untouched by emotion or obligation. And yet, as he sped by, something in the rearview mirror made him hesitate. He pulled over a few yards ahead, gripping the wheel. It was irrational, a complete waste of time, but before he could change his mind, he put the car in reverse and backed up beside them. Lowering the window, he barely resisted the urge to sigh. "Do you need help?" The woman turned, startled, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. She wasn't just some anonymous pedestrian caught in the storm. She had warm brown eyes, strands of dark hair clinging to her face, and despite the misery of her situation, there was no panic in her gaze, only exhaustion and quiet resilience. The little boy in her arms, no more than 6 or 7, buried his face against her shoulder, his small frame trembling. "Our car broke down a few minutes ago. I was going to call for a tow, but my phone died," she explained, raising her voice over the rain. "And I didn't want to leave him alone in the car while I walked." He glanced at the vehicle. It was old, the kind that had probably given her trouble before, and in this weather, there was no way she'd find help quickly. He should have just offered his phone, let her deal with it herself. That would have been the logical thing to do. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I'll give you a ride." She hesitated, looking at her son before nodding. "Thank you." She opened the passenger door, careful as she guided the little boy inside first. He clambered onto the seat, his damp sneakers barely touching the floor, and buckled himself in without a word. Matilda slid in next, closing the door with a quiet sigh of relief. The space inside the car felt smaller now, filled with the scent of rain and something faintly floral, probably from her. Tristan kept his eyes ahead as he pulled back onto the road, regretting the decision already. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Greenview Apartments, about 15 minutes from here," she said, brushing damp hair from her face. Tristan nodded and focused on the road. The sound of rain drummed against the roof, filling the silence that settled between them. It was an odd thing, driving strangers through a storm, but even odder was how she didn't seem fazed by him. Most people, once they recognized him, either gushed in admiration or recoiled in wariness. But she hadn't even given him a second glance beyond that first moment. After a few minutes, the little boy spoke, his voice soft but clear. "You have a nice car." Tristan glanced at him through the mirror. The kid had wide, curious eyes, a little too observant for his age. "Thanks," he said, not used to entertaining conversations with children. The boy, apparently unbothered by his short response, continued. "Mom says fancy cars aren't important, but I think they're cool." Matilda sighed, shaking her head. "Noah." "What?" The boy looked at her, then at Tristan. "It's true. But Mom doesn't care about stuff like that." Tristan raised an eyebrow. "And what does she care about?" Noah leaned back in his seat as if considering. "Books, mostly. And making people happy. And coffee." Matilda groaned. Okay, that's enough about me. Tristan smirked slightly, the first genuine reaction he'd had all day. Books, happiness, and coffee. Not a bad combination. The boy smiled as if proud of himself for getting a reaction, but then his expression turned thoughtful. He watched the way Tristan occasionally glanced at his mother, the way she responded with polite but effortless ease. The silence stretched just long enough before he asked, "Is this how love begins?" The words hit like an unexpected jolt. Tristan blinked, the question so sudden, so innocent, that for a moment he wasn't sure he'd heard it right. Matilda laughed, shaking her head. "Noah, honey, where did that come from?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know. It just feels like a story. A man rescues a woman in the rain, and then they fall in love. That's what happens in movies." Tristan could have ignored it. He could have redirected the conversation, let it slip past like nothing more than childish fantasy. But for some reason, he didn't. Maybe it was the way Matilda's laughter faded into a softer, almost wistful smile. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, someone had said the word, love, in his presence without it being tied to a contract or transaction. "Movies aren't real life," he finally said, keeping his eyes on the road. Noah didn't seem disappointed by the answer. If anything, he nodded as if filing the information away. "But sometimes, right?" he pressed. "Sometimes it starts like this." Matilda reached over and ruffled his hair. "Enough, little philosopher. Let the man drive." Tristan let the conversation die there, but as he turned onto the street leading to their apartment complex, he realized something strange. The rain outside hadn't let up, but for the first time in a long time, the silence in his car didn't feel empty. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle by the time Tristan pulled up in front of the Greenview apartments. The building was modest, the kind of place he hadn't stepped foot in since his early 20s, back when he was clawing his way out of nothing. He barely remembered what it felt like to live somewhere that wasn't wrapped in luxury, where every crack in the pavement or flickering street lamp was just a part of life instead of something to be fixed with a phone call and a check. He killed the engine, glancing at Matilda as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She looked tired but grateful, her damp clothes still clinging to her like the storm itself had refused to let her go. Noah stretched in the back seat, rubbing his eyes, and for the first time since he'd gotten into the car, he looked small, fragile in the way only children could be after a long day. "Thank you," Matilda said, turning to him with a sincerity he wasn't used to. People thanked him all the time, but it was usually for business deals, for money, for things that came with expectation. This was different. She wasn't thanking him because she wanted something more. She was just grateful. Tristan gave a small nod, unsure of what to say. He wasn't accustomed to lingering in moments like this. "Get inside before you both catch pneumonia." Matilda chuckled, shaking her head. "Come on, Noah." The boy unbuckled himself but paused before opening the door. "Are we gonna see you again?" Tristan hesitated. The logical answer was no. This wasn't his world. He had no reason to return, no reason to entangle himself in the lives of a single mother and her son. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't say no. He just exhaled, meeting the boy's wide-eyed curiosity with a measured look. "Take care of your mom, kid." Noah beamed as if that answer was good enough. Then he scrambled out of the car, and Matilda followed, giving Tristan one last look before leading her son toward the building. He watched them disappear through the entrance, and then, without giving himself time to think about why he was still sitting there, he shifted into drive and pulled away. That should have been the end of it. A good deed done. A momentary detour in his carefully structured life. And yet, as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The weight of Noah's question lingered in the back of his mind. Is this how love begins? It was ridiculous. The musings of a child. And yet it gnawed at him, because for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him and seen something other than power or money. The next day, Tristan went through the motions as usual. Meetings, calls, the endless churn of his corporate empire demanding his attention. But there were moments, fleeting, unwelcome, where his mind drifted. He'd catch himself staring out the window, remembering the way Matilda had smiled even when she was drenched, or the way Noah had asked about love with the kind of innocence Tristan had lost long ago. It was absurd. He didn't do this. He didn't dwell on strangers. And yet, here he was, wondering if they'd made it through the night without getting sick, if Matilda had managed to get her car fixed, if Noah was still asking questions about fairy tales. Meanwhile, in a much humbler part of the city, Noah had not stopped talking about the mysterious man who had driven them home. He sat at the kitchen table, munching on cereal while Matilda sorted through bills, his feet swinging beneath his chair. "Mom, do you think he's like one of those princes from the books?" Matilda sighed, not looking up. "Noah, not everyone with a nice car is a prince. But he helped us in the rain. That's what happens in stories." She finally glanced at him, smiling despite herself. "Sweetheart, life isn't a fairy tale." Noah frowned. "But sometimes it could be, right?" Matilda shook her head, going back to her bills. She didn't have time for fairy tales. She had a job, a child to raise, and more responsibilities than she cared to count. The last thing she needed was her son getting attached to the idea that the rich man who had given them a ride home was some kind of storybook hero. Tristan Sinclair was clearly out of their league, and men like him didn't just show up in people's lives without reason. But as the day wore on, she found herself thinking about him anyway. There had been something in his eyes, something behind the cold exterior that made her wonder. He had money, power, everything society said should make a man content, and yet he had looked strangely alone. Like someone who had spent too much time on his own, convincing himself he was fine with it. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep, she curled up on the couch with a book, but her mind kept drifting. She could still hear the rain from the night before, still feel the warmth of the car after being soaked to the bone. She knew she would never see him again. There was no reason for their paths to cross twice. And yet, she found herself staring at the window, wondering why she had this strange feeling that their story wasn't over just yet. At that very moment, across the city, Tristan sat in his office, staring at the skyline but seeing something else entirely. He had spent years building a world where emotions didn't matter, where attachments were distractions, and yet here he was, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted in him. He told himself it was nothing. Just a passing thought. And yet, when his assistant came in to confirm his schedule for the next day, he found himself asking a question he had no business asking. "What's the name of that charity event this weekend? The one I was invited to?" His assistant raised a brow, surprised. "The Greenview Foundation Gala? You never go to those things." Tristan tapped his fingers against his desk, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's time I did." The evening of the Greenview Foundation Gala arrived faster than Matilda expected, though she had been too busy to dwell on it. Organizing the event had consumed most of her time, leaving little room for anything else. Between coordinating volunteers, finalizing guest lists, and ensuring everything ran smoothly, she barely had a moment to think about the man who had driven her and Noah home in the rain. And yet, as she adjusted the table settings and made sure the auction items were properly displayed, she caught herself glancing toward the entrance more times than she cared to admit. It was ridiculous. There was no reason to expect him to be here. Men like Tristan Sinclair didn't show up for charity galas unless there was a business angle or PR incentive, and from what little she had seen of him, he didn't seem the type to care about appearances. Still, when she turned toward the main entrance and saw him step inside, her breath caught for just a second. He wasn't in a perfectly tailored suit meant for a boardroom, though what he wore was no less expensive. A black tuxedo, effortless yet precise, the kind of look only a man with his level of wealth could pull off, as though it required no thought. His presence shifted the energy of the room in a way that made people subtly straighten their backs, whispering as they recognized him. But Tristan barely seemed to notice. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the opulence of the ballroom, the clusters of well-dressed guests, the grand chandelier that bathed everything in golden light. And then his gaze landed on her. For a second, either of them moved. Matilda felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had been dropped into one of the very fairy tales Noah had been talking about. It was absurd. A week ago, he had been a stranger. A fleeting moment in the middle of a storm. And yet now, here he was, standing in the same room, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Tristan had told himself he was coming tonight out of nothing more than idle curiosity. That was the logical explanation. He wasn't the type to chase after moments, or let fleeting interactions linger in his mind. And yet here he was, scanning the room for a woman he barely knew, feeling something unsettlingly close to anticipation when he finally spotted her. She looked different tonight, though it had nothing to do with her deep green dress or the way her hair framed her face. It was the way she belonged here, moving through the room with warmth and ease, stopping to speak with guests, offering laughter and sincerity in a way that made him acutely aware of the contrast between them. She made her way toward him, her posture poised but cautious, as if unsure whether to be surprised or wary of his presence. "Tristan Sinclair," she said when she finally reached him. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you here." He gave her a small, knowing smirk. "I could say the same." Matilda raised a brow. "You were invited. I work here." "Touché." He glanced around, taking in the event she had clearly spent weeks preparing. "You put this together?" "Not alone, but I had a big part in it," she said, folding her arms as she studied him. "What's your excuse for being here? Would you believe me if I said charity?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Not even for a second." He didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he let his gaze linger on her for just a fraction longer than necessary. "I suppose I was curious." Matilda tilted her head, something amused but guarded flickering in her eyes. "About what?" Tristan considered his answer for a beat. The truth was complicated. He wasn't the kind of man who let people stay in his head, yet she and her son had managed to do just that. The sound of Noah's voice asking, "Is this how love begins?" had replayed in his mind more than once, unsettling in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent his life surrounding himself with people who were predictable, business partners, investors, acquaintances who knew the rules of his world. But Matilda wasn't part of that world, and she wasn't playing by any of the rules he was used to. Before he could answer, she was pulled away by a guest who needed her attention. Tristan watched as she moved effortlessly through the crowd, greeting people with the kind of warmth that he had never been able to fake. He wasn't the only one watching her. He could see it in the way others gravitated toward her, drawn in by something he didn't quite understand. He wasn't used to feeling like an outsider. In most rooms, he was the center of gravity, the one people adjusted themselves around. But here, he was just another guest, and Matilda Carter was the one who belonged. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Matilda wasn't entirely sure why she kept glancing in Tristan's direction as the night went on. He was polite when approached, but there was something about him that remained detached, as if he were observing rather than participating. She wondered what he saw when he looked at this world, if he viewed it as nothing more than an obligation, a room full of people seeking donations. Or if, maybe, some small part of him wished he could belong in a place like this, where connection wasn't a transaction. She found him again later in the evening, standing near the bar, nursing a drink with the same careful detachment he had held all night. "Having fun yet?" she asked, leaning slightly against the counter. He gave her a dry look. "Define fun." Matilda smirked. "Let me guess. You're used to events where people fight to impress you. This must be disorienting." He chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It's not unpleasant." She studied him for a moment, then softened. "Why are you really here, Tristan?" He met her gaze, and for a brief second, something flickered there, something unguarded, something he wasn't sure he wanted her to see. "I'm not sure yet." Matilda didn't push him for more. Instead, she simply nodded, as if understanding something he wasn't ready to admit. And for the first time since he had arrived, Tristan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. A quiet pull, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He wasn't sure what it meant, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the last time he would see her. The days following the gala should have returned to normal, but something had shifted. Matilda told herself it was nothing, just a chance encounter that would fade into the background of her busy life. But Tristan Sinclair had a way of lingering, not just in her thoughts, but in subtle, unexpected ways. At first, it was small. A generous, anonymous donation to the Greenview Foundation that she knew, without asking, had come from him. Then, a few days later, she arrived at the community center to find brand new computers in the resource room, replacing the outdated models they'd been struggling with for years. No announcement, no ceremony, just there, waiting to be used. She should have been grateful. She was grateful. But something about it unsettled her. She had seen wealthy men throw money at problems before, sometimes to ease their guilt, sometimes to buy goodwill. She didn't want to be someone's charity case, and she certainly didn't want to let herself believe he was doing this for her. Noah, however, was convinced otherwise. "He's a prince, Mom," he said one evening as they ate dinner, his voice full of certainty. "He saved us in the rain, and now he's helping your work. That's what princes do." Matilda sighed, pushing a stray curl behind her ear. "Noah, he's not a prince. He's just a rich guy with a fancy car." Yeah, I know," Noah said, rolling his eyes. "But what if he is a prince and just doesn't know it yet?" Matilda laughed, shaking her head. "You read too many fairy tales." But later that night, as she sat on the couch with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about it. Tristan Sinclair wasn't a prince. He was a man who had built walls around himself so high that he barely seemed to notice when people tried to reach him. He wasn't the type to play the hero, and yet, he had stopped in the rain. He had come to the gala. And now, without drawing attention to himself, he was making things easier for the very place that meant the most to her. She didn't want to ask what that meant. A week later, they found themselves together again, this time in the quiet of the community center, setting up for a small fundraising event. Most of the volunteers had gone home for the night, leaving only a few last-minute details to handle. Matilda hadn't expected Tristan to show up, but he had, and now he stood beside her, rolling up his sleeves as he helped arrange tables and string up lights. "I didn't take you for the hands-on type," she said, watching as he tied off a section of twinkle lights along the ceiling. Tristan smirked. "You think I don't know how to hang lights? I think you pay people to do things like this." He let out a low chuckle. "You're not wrong." He stepped back, admiring his work, then turned to her. "But I don't mind helping when it's for a good cause." She studied him for a moment. The man she had met in the rain had been distant, a little cold, a figure made of wealth and detachment. But here, in the quiet of the community center, with his sleeves pushed up and a light dusting of dust on his shirt, he looked different. Less untouchable. More real. "Why are you doing this, Tristan?" she asked softly. "Donating to the foundation, showing up here. What do you get out of it?" His expression shifted, something almost imperceptible flickering behind his eyes. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, finally, he exhaled, leaning against one of the tables. "I grew up in a place not much different from this," he admitted. "Small, rundown community centers, charity events that barely scraped together enough to keep the lights on. My mother worked 3 jobs just to make ends meet. There was no safety net, no one looking out for us." Matilda hadn't expected that. She had assumed he had come from privilege, that men like him always had a foundation of wealth beneath them. But this changed the way she saw him. "I worked my way out of it," Tristan continued, his voice quieter now. "Made sure I'd never have to worry about money again. But sometimes I wonder if any of it means anything if you don't use it for something real." Matilda swallowed, feeling an unexpected tightness in her chest. She had spent years working in places like this, seeing firsthand what it meant to struggle. And now, looking at Tristan, she realized he understood in a way most men of his status never could. "You don't talk about this much, do you?" she asked. He let out a short laugh. "Not exactly boardroom conversation." She smiled, something warm and knowing passing between them. Well, I think it means something. What you're doing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the overhead lights filled the space between them, the air charged with something unspoken. He was close, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the shift in the space between them. She looked away first, breaking the moment before it could settle into something she wasn't ready for. She had been down this road before, letting herself believe in something, only to end up hurt. She had learned not to trust things that felt too good, too unexpected. But as she moved to adjust a stack of chairs, she heard Tristan's voice, low and thoughtful. You were wrong, you know. She turned, frowning slightly. About what? He met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. Fairy tales. Maybe they're not real in the way Noah thinks. But sometimes people surprise you. Matilda didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she just nodded, feeling a warmth she didn't want to name settle in her chest. Because for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was the one who was wrong. The next few weeks passed in a way that almost felt normal, almost. Matilda and Tristan had settled into something unspoken, a quiet understanding that neither of them had dared to define. He continued finding ways to help the foundation without making a spectacle of it, showing up at events, dropping by the community center with donations that always seemed carefully thought out rather than impersonal. Matilda had stopped questioning it, though deep down, a small part of her wondered how much longer this strange, fragile connection could last before reality set in. And then, reality came crashing down. It started with a headline. A scandal brewing in the heart of Sinclair Industries, something about a board member accused of insider trading, stock prices fluctuating, investors panicking. Matilda didn't follow business news, but even she saw the headlines. Tristan's name was everywhere, attached to the mess in ways that made it clear this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. He was under pressure, under scrutiny, and just like that, he was gone. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. That he was just busy, caught up in whatever corporate disaster had landed in his lap. But then a week passed. Then two. No calls. No texts. No unexpected visits to the community center. No discreet donations appearing in her inbox. The silence stretched, and with each passing day, Matilda felt a familiar, bitter ache settle in her chest. She had been foolish to believe this could be anything more than what it was. She had known better. One night, after she had tucked Noah into bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring at nothing. It shouldn't hurt, but it did. She had told herself she wasn't getting attached, that Tristan Sinclair was nothing more than an unexpected detour in her life. But now that he had disappeared, she couldn't pretend his absence didn't feel like something missing. Noah, as always, noticed. One evening, while they were cleaning up after dinner, he looked up at her with his wide, thoughtful eyes and asked, "Are you sad, Mom?" She smiled, forcing something light into her voice. "Of course not, sweetheart. Why would you think that?" Noah frowned, clearly not convinced. "Because you look sad. And because Mr. Tristan hasn't come around. Did he stop liking us?" Matilda swallowed against a lump in her throat, crouching down so they were eye level. "No, honey, it's not like that. He's just busy." Noah was quiet for a long moment, chewing over the answer in the way he always did when he wasn't quite sure if he believed her. Then he tilted his head, his voice soft with confusion. "But I thought love doesn't just disappear?" Matilda felt her breath hitch, the simplicity of the words cutting deeper than she expected. She had no idea where he had picked that up, probably from a book or one of the old movies they sometimes watched together, but the weight of it settled into her chest like a stone. "No," she said gently, running a hand through his curls. "It doesn't. But sometimes people do." Noah considered that, his brows furrowing. "That's dumb." Matilda let out a soft laugh, though there was little humor in it. "Yeah, sweetheart. It is." That night, she made a decision. She wasn't going to waste any more time wondering why Tristan had pulled away. She had spent too much of her life waiting for people who didn't stay, and she wasn't going to do it again. She threw herself into work, into raising Noah, into moving forward. If Tristan had been a brief chapter in her story, then so be it. He had walked away, and she wouldn't chase after a man who had made his choice so clear. Across the city, in the penthouse that suddenly felt too large, Tristan stared at his phone for what felt like the 100th time that night. He had typed and deleted a dozen messages, none of them right. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that the last few weeks had been chaos, that he had been pulled into meetings, press conferences, damage control that seemed endless. But mostly, he wanted to tell her that it wasn't just the scandal keeping him away. It was the fact that, for the first time in his life, he had realized how easy it would be to let her in. To let her become something more. And that terrified him. Matilda Carter wasn't a woman who fit into his world, and he wasn't a man who fit into hers. He had convinced himself that keeping his distance was the right thing, that she deserved someone who could offer her something simple, steady, free of the complications that came with being Tristan Sinclair. And yet, as he sat there in his silent apartment, staring at the empty space where she had been just weeks ago, he couldn't shake the gnawing, persistent feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Tristan had spent his life making decisions with precision. Every move calculated, every outcome anticipated. It was how he had built his empire, how he had stayed untouchable in a world where trust was a liability. But as the weeks passed and the distance between him and Matilda grew wider, he realized something unsettling. He had never fought for anyone. Not really. People had come and gone, and he had let them. He had assumed they would leave eventually or betray him first. It was easier that way, cleaner. But this wasn't clean. It gnawed at him, kept him awake at night, made his penthouse feel colder than it ever had before. He told himself that Matilda had probably moved on, that she was better off without the mess that came with being in his world. And yet, when he found himself driving past the community center one afternoon, unable to stop himself, he realized just how wrong he had been. She was there, standing near the entrance, laughing at something a colleague had said. She looked fine. Unbothered. Untouched by the absence that had hollowed him out in ways he didn't want to admit. He should have left. He should have driven off and let her be. But then, just as he was about to pull away, he spotted Noah playing with another boy near the steps. And then he heard it. "Yeah, my mom says love doesn't just disappear," Noah was saying, his small voice carrying in the autumn air. "But I don't think grown-ups believe in love like in stories. They just pretend they do." Tristan felt something shift in his chest, something sharp and unrelenting. "Why do you think that?" the other boy asked. Noah shrugged. "Because when people care about each other in stories, they don't just leave. But in real life, they always do." Tristan sat frozen. A child's words shouldn't have had that much weight, but they did. Maybe because deep down, he knew Noah was right. He had spent his life believing love was something fragile, something breakable, something that could be discarded when it got too complicated. And now, he had proven it. Without giving himself time to overthink it, he stepped out of the car. Matilda saw him before he reached her, her expression shifting from surprise to something colder, more guarded. She crossed her arms, bracing herself, and for the first time, Tristan felt uncertain. He had walked into boardrooms full of people looking to rip him apart, had faced down ruthless competitors, but standing in front of Matilda Carter, he felt completely unprepared. "You've got some nerve," she said, her voice even but firm. He exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I know." She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "What do you want, Tristan?" "I want to explain," he said, and the words felt heavier than he expected. "I should have reached out. I should have." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I handled it wrong." Matilda let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You think? I thought I was doing the right thing," he admitted. "Keeping you away from all of it. The headlines, the mess. My life isn't simple, Matilda. I didn't want to drag you and Noah into something that wasn't yours to deal with." She stared at him, her jaw tightening. You don't get to decide what's mine to deal with. You don't get to show up, make me believe you actually. She cut herself off, shaking her head. You don't get to leave just because it's easier. His throat tightened. I wasn't leaving. Weren't you? She challenged. Because that's exactly what it felt like. And I can't. Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. I can't do that again. I can't let Noah get attached to someone who's just going to disappear when things get complicated. He deserves better than that. Tristan swallowed, the weight of her words settling deep. He had expected anger. He had expected frustration. But what he hadn't expected was how much it hurt to see the disappointment in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. Maybe not. But you did. She didn't give him a chance to say more. She turned, walking away before he could try to fix what felt irreparable. Tristan stood there, feeling something foreign and unfamiliar settle in his chest. He had never been the kind of man who chased after things. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. But this wasn't business. This wasn't something he could negotiate his way out of. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. Later that night, as he sat in his car outside his penthouse, debating whether he was capable of fixing anything at all, his phone buzzed. A message. From Noah. Mr. Tristan, if you like my mom, you should tell her. Grown-ups make things too hard. Just say sorry and mean it. Tristan stared at the words, something tight forming in his chest. And for the first time, he wondered if a 7-year-old had just given him the best advice he had ever received. Tristan read Noah's message at least a dozen times before setting his phone down. It was so simple, so unfiltered in its honesty, and yet it cut through all the noise in his head. Just say sorry and mean it. The words stuck with him. He had spent his life believing that actions mattered more than words, that money and power could solve most problems. But this wasn't a business deal he could negotiate. Matilda didn't need him to throw money at the situation, she needed him to show up. To be there. To prove that he wasn't just another person who would walk away. And so, for the first time in his life, Tristan Sinclair decided to fight. The next morning, he made a call. A big one. When the Greenview Foundation's board members received the news, they were stunned. It wasn't just a donation, it was the donation. A sum so substantial it would secure the foundation's future for years to come. But there was one stipulation, one detail Tristan had been adamant about. The donation would be made under Noah Carter's name. The 7-year-old would officially be listed as the youngest philanthropist in the city's history. The reaction was immediate. The media picked up the story within hours, and by noon, it was everywhere. People loved the narrative, an anonymous donor making a major contribution in a child's name, ensuring that his mother's work would thrive. Matilda saw the news while she was at the community center, standing frozen as a coworker excitedly read the article aloud. Noah Carter, age 7, has become the Greenview Foundation's youngest patron, thanks to an anonymous benefactor. She didn't need to be told who was behind it. Her stomach tightened, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't sure if she was furious, touched, or both. That evening, after picking Noah up from school, she found Tristan exactly where she knew he would be, standing outside the community center, hands in his pockets, waiting for her. You think this fixes everything? She asked the moment she stepped out of her car, her voice sharp as she approached him. He didn't flinch. No. But it's a start. Matilda exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Tristan, I never wanted your money. I never wanted a grand gesture. I know, he said. That's not why I did it. She frowned, arms crossed. Then why? He looked at her, his gaze steady. Because I wanted Noah to know that love doesn't just disappear. Her breath hitched. She wasn't expecting that. Tristan took a step closer, his voice softer now. I know I messed up. I pulled away because I thought I was protecting you from my world. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I don't know how to do this, Matilda. I don't know how to be the kind of man who stays, who shows up. But I want to learn. I want to try. Matilda's defenses wavered, just slightly. Tristan, I don't know how love begins, he admitted. But I want to find out. With you. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, there was no power imbalance, no walls between them. Just two people standing in the fading light, trying to figure out where they fit in each other's lives. Matilda swallowed hard. I don't need you to be perfect, Tristan. I don't need big gestures or fancy donations. I just need you to be consistent. To show up. His jaw tightened, and then he nodded. Then I will. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. Because this wasn't a fairy tale. There were no princes, no perfect endings. But maybe, just maybe, there was something real. The weeks that followed weren't perfect, but they were real. Tristan didn't suddenly transform into someone he wasn't, nor did Matilda expect him to. He was still meticulous, still guarded at times, still carrying the weight of a world she had never been part of. But there were differences now, small, quiet changes that mattered more than any grand gesture ever could. He showed up. At first, it was little things. Stopping by the community center after work, rolling up his sleeves without being asked. Showing up to Noah's soccer practice, even though he clearly had no idea how the game worked. Remembering that Matilda took her coffee with just a little too much sugar, that Noah liked to fall asleep with a book on his chest. It wasn't flashy, wasn't dramatic. But it was consistent, and that meant everything. Matilda had spent most of her life believing that love was something temporary, something that could slip through her fingers no matter how tightly she held on. She had built walls, convinced herself that expecting more was dangerous. But Tristan, in his own careful, stubborn way, was proving her wrong. Not with words, but with actions. With presence. Noah, of course, had never doubted it for a second. He had always believed that life worked like the stories he read, where the right people found their way back to each other. And if Tristan had needed time to figure it out, well, Noah had been patient. One evening, months after that first rainy night, they found themselves together at the park, the sky streaked in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Tristan sat on the bench beside Matilda, his arm draped casually along the backrest, while Noah ran ahead toward the small pond, tossing pebbles into the water. Matilda let out a soft sigh, watching as Noah laughed at the ripples his stone had made. "He's happy," she murmured. Tristan followed her gaze, his expression softer than it used to be. "He should be. He's a great kid." She turned to look at him. "You're a big part of that now, you know." He glanced at her then, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "I'm trying." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "You don't have to try so hard. Just being here is enough." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the water, the rustling leaves, the distant chatter of families enjoying the evening air. And then Noah, ever curious, ever the dreamer, turned back toward them with a thoughtful look on his face. "So, this is how love begins, right?" he asked, tilting his head in that way he always did when he was puzzling something out. Matilda felt Tristan shift beside her, felt his quiet chuckle vibrate against her. She looked up at him, catching the warmth in his gaze before turning back to Noah. "Something like that," she said, smiling. Noah grinned, satisfied with the answer, and went back to throwing his pebbles, as if he had solved one of life's greatest mysteries. Tristan exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing against Matilda's where they rested on her lap. "It doesn't feel like a beginning," he murmured. "It feels like we've been heading here all along." She turned her hand over, threading her fingers through his, holding on. "Maybe we have." There was no perfect moment, no fairy tale ending. Just this. A quiet evening, a boy laughing by the water, two people learning how to be in something real. Not just a fleeting moment, but a journey. And that was enough. It was everything. The sound of rain drummed softly against the windows, a steady, rhythmic tap that filled the quiet apartment. The night had stretched long, and though Matilda had told herself she would go to bed, she found herself curled up on the couch instead, a book open in her lap but unread, her thoughts somewhere else. The apartment felt different at night when Tristan wasn't home. Not empty, not lonely exactly, but waiting. She glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. This wasn't the first time he had come home late, and it wouldn't be the last. She understood his world, understood that running an empire wasn't a 9-to-5 job. But understanding didn't always mean it was easy. A few months ago, she might have told herself that this was the beginning of the end, that this was how people started slipping away, little by little, absence turning into distance, distance turning into detachment. But things were different now. He was different. And yet, some small part of her, the part shaped by past disappointments, by people who had promised things they couldn't keep, still struggled to fully trust in something that felt this solid, this safe. The sound of a key turning in the lock made her sit up, heart beating a little faster than she cared to admit. The door eased open, and Tristan stepped inside, his suit jacket draped over his arm, the top button of his dress shirt undone, exhaustion lining his sharp features. His gaze found her almost immediately, and he froze, brow furrowing slightly. "You're still up?" Matilda shrugged, setting her book aside. "Couldn't sleep." He exhaled, stepping further inside, loosening his tie before tossing his jacket over a chair. "I should have called." "You should have," she agreed, but there was no bite to her words. She had long since learned that anger wouldn't change anything, that what mattered wasn't reprimanding him, but seeing what he did next. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "It wasn't supposed to go this late. Meeting ran over. Then another issue came up." She nodded, waiting. Tristan ran a hand through his hair, stepping closer, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to leave you waiting." Matilda studied him, watching the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. It was a side of him that the world never saw, the part of him that had spent years believing he had to be untouchable, unshakable. But here, in this space they had built together, he didn't have to be. She patted the couch beside her, and after a beat, he sank down with a quiet exhale. "You've been doing it again," she said softly, not accusing, just stating a fact. He ran a hand down his face. "I know. You said you'd try." "I am trying." She tilted her head, watching him. "Then why does it feel like you're afraid of letting this be real?" He tensed, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers curling slightly, as if he was holding something back. "Matilda," he started, then stopped, as if searching for the right words. "This is real to me. You and Noah. This us, it's not just something I take lightly. But I've spent my whole life not knowing how to do this. How to balance it. How to be." He trailed off, exhaling sharply. "I don't want to mess it up." Her expression softened. He wasn't pulling away. He was afraid of losing this. Of losing them. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, and after a moment he turned his palm over, letting their hands fit together. "You don't have to be perfect, Tristan," she murmured. "I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to be here. To show up." His grip tightened slightly around hers, as if grounding himself in that truth. "I'm here," he said, voice quiet but firm. "Always." The words settled into something deep inside her, pressing into the cracks she had spent years keeping hidden, into the spaces that had never quite healed. And she realized, in that moment, that she believed him. They sat in comfortable silence, the rain tapping against the glass, the city stretching beyond them. "Is Noah asleep?" Tristan asked after a while, his voice quieter now. She nodded. "Out like a light. He wanted to wait up, but I told him you'd be home late." He let out a soft chuckle. "He still calls me Prince Tristan sometimes." Matilda smiled. "That's because he still thinks life works like a fairy tale." Tristan turned his gaze toward her, something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe he's not wrong." She raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Are you saying you are a prince?" He smirked. "I think we both know I'd be the brooding, reluctant kind." Matilda laughed, shaking her head. Yeah, that sounds about right. Tristan squeezed her hand once before letting go, leaning back against the couch. I like this, he admitted, glancing toward the dimly lit apartment. Coming home to something. To you. To him. Her heart ached in the best way possible. Good, she murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. Because we're not going anywhere. He let out a slow breath, and in that moment she felt it, the weight he had been carrying finally ease, even if just a little. Love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect endings. It wasn't about fitting into a mold or following some predetermined path. It was about this. About showing up, even when it was hard. About choosing each other, every day. Noah had asked once if this was how love began. But Matilda knew now that love wasn't just a beginning. It was this. The everyday moments. The quiet spaces. The choice to stay. And for the first time in her life, she knew, without a doubt, that she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. Because this time, it was real. And Tristan Sinclair? He was home. The rain had stopped by the time Matilda finally stirred from her place on the couch, but the world outside still shimmered with the remnants of the storm. Puddles glowed under streetlights, the city washed clean in the way only a fresh rain could manage. Beside her, Tristan was quiet, but his hand remained in hers, solid and steady, as if he was afraid to let go. She had spent so much of her life preparing for the moment when someone would leave. It was an instinct, a learned behavior, a quiet bracing for the inevitable. And yet here they were. Tristan, the man who once held himself apart from the world, was still sitting beside her, his presence not fleeting, not temporary. He had come back. He had chosen them. And maybe that was what love really was. Not just a grand entrance, or a sweeping moment, but the staying. The choice to come home, even when it would have been easier to leave. Noah would wake up soon, probably crawl into the space between them on the couch, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking questions that only a child would think to ask. Maybe he would smile and say, "See, I told you Prince Tristan would come back." Maybe he would ask if this was still a love story, if this was the part where they all lived happily ever after. Matilda smiled to herself. Not a fairy tale. Something better. Fairy tales ended with a kiss, with a promise, with a happily ever after sealed in a single moment. But love, real love, wasn't about a moment. It was about the everyday, the quiet, the knowing. It was about making coffee in the morning and remembering exactly how the other took it. It was about waiting up on the couch, trusting that the other would always walk through the door. It was about showing up to soccer games and school plays and community events, about sitting at a dinner table and knowing, without a doubt, that this was home. Tristan exhaled beside her, his fingers playing absently with hers. "You're thinking too much," he murmured, his voice low and warm. She smirked. "I do that sometimes." He turned to look at her, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "I mean it, you know. When I say I'm here. I don't know what love is supposed to look like. I didn't grow up seeing it. I don't know how to be perfect at this, but I know I want to be here." Matilda squeezed his hand, her throat tightening. "You don't have to be perfect. Just present." He nodded, and for the first time, she saw it, not the man the world knew, not the businessman with a name that carried weight and power, but the man beneath it all. The man who had spent a lifetime convincing himself that love wasn't for him, only to realize, maybe too late, that he had been wrong all along. But it wasn't too late. Not now. Noah's words echoed in her mind. Love doesn't just disappear. No. It didn't. It stayed. It grew. It became something stronger than either of them had expected. Tristan wasn't her fairy tale prince, and she wasn't the kind of woman who needed rescuing. But together they had built something better, something real, something earned, something worth holding onto. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as his arm wrapped around her. The city stretched out before them, full of possibilities, full of tomorrows. And for the first time in a long time, Matilda wasn't afraid of what came next. Because this wasn't just how love began. This was how it stayed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.